This is a presentation of simple free energy devices, but you need to understand very clearly that this presentation must not be thought of as an encouragement that you should attempt to construct anything shown or discussed here, as this presentation is for information purposes only. Let's start by discussing the very nice generator created by Denis Saburin. This is a very interesting device, as is the inventor, Denis, who does not really understand much about electronics at all, and who is allergic to winding coils. This particular generator is very interesting. It's built on top of a fan intended to be driven by a USB connection and cool a laptop computer. He has taken a yellow float from a commercial fishing net and glued that to the motor, the fan motor of this device, and he has mounted around the outside 8 separate coils, each coil being wound with 2 strands of wire, and is so called a bifilar coil. It's a very simple self-powered generator which can charge a cell phone battery. The plastic float is glued directly to the motor. It forms a rotor, and it has 4 N52 grade neodymium magnets glued to the outside. Now, those magnets pass by the coils of those 8 separate arrangements. Now, he has connected both windings of 2 coils together so that he has 4 pairs of 2 sets of wires. But the way he has connected them is very interesting. The way he's done it gives a 65% increase in output for a 15% increase in input. Now, you can see here the way that the connections are made. A pair of coils has got 4 strands of wire in the windings. One pair of coils is marked in blue, another pair of coils is marked in red, and you'll notice the way that they're interconnected. So one of the windings of the blue coil are connected to one of the windings of the red coil, which is an unusual way of doing the connection, and then all of the blue coils are connected together to form the minus when it's passed through a diode bridge, and all of the red coils are connected together through the diode bridge to form the positive connection. Now, Denis chooses to rotate this yellow disc rotor quite slowly. He spins it at approximately 60 revs per minute. That means once per second. And doing that, these coils have a substantial output. And this output is used to charge a 3-volt lithium battery. It's actually 3.7 volts nominally and can charge to 4 volts. And that battery powers a commercial module which produces a USB output, and that output suits the mobile phone with its battery protection circuitry against overcharging. The problem here is that the 3-volt lithium battery, which runs the rotor driving the motor, is discharging steadily, although that battery can sustain the drive motor for a very long time. Denis dealt with that problem by diverting the charging current to the battery and feeding it to battery number 1 for 10 seconds every 10 minutes using a separate switching box. However, that simple task does need a switching box which requires input power to make it operate. So he's changed the arrangement to feed a small amount of the charging current continuously to the drive battery, eliminating the switching box. It's like you see in the illustration here. The output from the coils goes to the diode bridge, and with the switching box, once every 10 minutes, 10 seconds worth of power is pushed through to battery 1. But he has made that more efficient and effective by instead passing continuously the current through a diode to battery 1 and limiting the current with a resistor which he chooses to suit his particular operation. The diode bridge, most of the power is sent out to battery number 2, and that powers the USB module, which powers the mobile phone while it's charging. This is a very simple arrangement, which is self-powered and which can charge mobile phone batteries. This is a good design, very simple, and the way that Dennis has done it points out to you that just because you're not familiar with the electronics does not mean that you cannot build free energy devices. You most definitely can. Okay, moving on, we come to a design which was built by a gentleman called Mr. Wilson in Texas. He did it in 1990 because he had spare components lying around. He worked a lot on cars, but he had a 5-foot diameter wooden table, circular wooden table, which was 2 inches thick, that's 50 millimeters, and he converted that to appear to be a V drive around the outside just by banging in nails every so often to create a V arrangement around the edge of the table. He mounted the table so that it could spin vertically, and he took a long drive cable and put it round the table, round past a DC motor which drives the system, and that DC motor drives 2 separate car generators or alternators, and the DC motor is driven by 2 12-volt car batteries which are individually recharged by one of the generators. The second generator powers a load, which can be any 12-volt equipment that you feel like. The table is quite heavy. I calculate that it would be at least 60 kilograms, which is a good deal more than Chas Campbell's very effective early flywheel design. The system that he used, though, to keep the drive belt going round the table was very ineffective. The system ran very nicely for 3 days, but after 3 days the nails that he knocked into the wooden table started falling out, and that caused him to stop doing what he was doing. We tend to think of free energy devices as being complicated and difficult to understand and so on, but Raoul Hatem has powered hotels with his arrangement of equipment. Scientists, so-called, dispute him because they say that what he does is impossible. What he actually does is he has one generator which drives 4 separate generators. One motor which drives 4 separate generators. These generators are indirectly connected together using powerful neodymium magnets. Each generator has got 36 of them, and those are arranged so that the rotation of the motor is passed to each generator, and the generators rotate in alternating directions. Now, it doesn't really matter to a generator which way around it spins, but if you feel that it does, all you have to do is change the direction that the generator points. So one can point north, the next one can point south, third one can point north, fourth one can point south, in which case they all rotate in what to them appears to be the same direction. these rows of magnets are angled in opposite directions on each rotor so that they match perfectly the magnets on the adjoining rotor. You'll notice from the red arrows the angle of the row of magnets. One points upwards, one points downwards. And while the magnets are expensive, this is a very simple way to access free energy. I understand that Raoul considers this system to have a coefficient of performance of 10. There are simple ways of accessing free energy which don't involve anything fancy at all. We always think of free energy as being a high-tech operation, but it doesn't have to be. The Earth itself contains a very, very large amount of power, and that power can be tapped off quite simply. What you do is you make a large battery arrangement. The batteries are built into troughs in the ground, which are dug out and filled loosely with earth, and the earth is then saturated with a suitable liquid material. The individual battery components, the cells, are separated by a considerable distance. In his case, he found that 735 millimeters suited him well. So we're talking really 3/4 of a meter, or 2.5 feet, 2 3/4 feet, for people who think in feet and inches. Each of the elements is buried in its own prepared body of earth, and they act as separate components if the separation between adjoining elements is considerable. Now, the way that an individual element is built is that it uses two bars, or if you prefer a U-shaped bar of a metal, and a single straight bar of carbon. Now, the metal, if the metal happens to be, for instance, magnesium, then you get a very good voltage from the arrangement itself. You get more than 2 volts on each cell, which is more than you get in the cells of a lead acid battery. The idea, though, is to keep the ground elements saturated, and in the early days you add some liquid to each of these excavated cells. The solution used is rich in oxygen, chlorine, bromine, iodine or fluorine, or with the salt of an alkali. Steel electrodes can be used. Magnesium gives you 2 1/4 volts, with 12 volts being your desired target voltage. You can then use a powerful inverter to operate heavy household equipment such as a washing machine or a tumble dryer, both of which can use over 2 kilowatts of power at any given moment. But the design that's shown here is very effective, and it can produce 3 kilowatts of continuous power day in, day out for as long as you want. If we take a look now at aerials, people who consider themselves to be experts say you can't draw any reasonable amount of power from an aerial because it'll be tuned to a radio station, and you'll only get a tiny fraction of the power being put out by the radio station. That, as usual, is completely wrong. You can draw considerable power from an aerial. Aerials pick up radio stations only if they're tuned to the frequency of the radio station. So what you want for a power gathering aerial is an untuned arrangement, so that it has what you would call wide band reception. It powers draws power from the sun, which charges the ionosphere, and from something like 200 lightning strikes around the world every second. And there are many really good designs from developers such as Jez Ascanius, Alex Core, and Dragan Glagic. A basic module for receiving power can be like this. In this case, from Jez, he uses a drum of at least 20 turns of single strand wire on the drum and leads the wire vertically downwards to a module which converts the aerial signal to actual DC power. He uses very simple arrangements, small capacity capacitors, 200 nanofarads, and rated at 200 volts. He uses germanium diodes, which is an important thing to use in aerials because you're dealing with low-level signals initially, and you don't want to waste voltage by needing a high voltage diode such as a silicon type. And then there are a couple of electrolytic capacitors for storing the actual charge. And you have a negative output and a positive output and an earth connection. Now, the way that Jez has built his is mainly with components retrieved from scavenging from discarded materials, discarded equipment. He can also operate using a metal plate. This metal plate is aluminium, 800 millimeters by 600 millimeters, 2 millimeters thick, and it can be suspended inside the attic where he lives, and it's suspended with twisted nylon cord to insulate it while it still is being supported. Ideally, the modules, which are marked as M, are connected halfway between the pickup plate or coil and the actual earth connections, and it's commonly found that it's better if you have two separate earth connections. Now, it looks a bit mad this way, where you have the wire coming straight down to an earthing coil and your modules are taken off and down to a second earthing coil. But this in actual fact works very well, though the two earthing rods need to be a reasonable distance apart. In his case, he discovered that 2 meters was a realistic amount. Now, it is possible, has been discovered since, to drastically improve the output of that module by increasing the number of components in the module and effectively building what's a mirror image of the circuit on the other side of the electrolytic capacitors. That effectively doubles the DC output from the aerial. But before that was discovered, Dragan built 2 module boards like this, on which he mounted 50 separate rectification modules for his aerial. And with his 2 boards he got 100 watts of output continuously from them. Now, you've seen so that you can use turns of wire on a coil as the top of your aerial. You can alternatively use a metal plate, and Tesla recommends a shiny metal plate which is insulated. Alex Core does it as well, but he uses a horizontal aerial like Thomas Henry Moray did, and he does that to charge batteries in the 1.5 to 6 volt range. His main part of the aerial is 60 meters long or more before it goes vertically down to the circuit, and he uses only a single earth connection. But that does work well for him. It's quite possible to use a different arrangement. You can take the horizontal aerial and feed it to a rectifier system he uses 3 of them here, and the rectified output is stored in a 100 μ 400 volt capacitor, and that's connected across a battery, but it can't flow into the battery because there is a silicon controlled rectifier blocking the circuit and ensuring that the battery is effectively disconnected until such time as the charge on the capacitor builds up to a level which is 12 volts over the firing voltage required by the neon. This little neon bulb is very small, very cheap, but the voltage across it will build up to about 100 volts or so. So when the capacitor gets up to about 110 volts, the neon fires, switches on the silicon controlled rectifier, and feeds a very large punch of current into the 12 volt battery. Now that's an arrangement which works very well, and it's one which can be used, if you wish, by pretty much anyone. Alright, we've been looking at ordinary aerial systems which generate 100 watts or can charge batteries and so on, and are relatively benign. But that doesn't mean that all aerials are. Now, if you were to mess around with the mains voltage that is supplying the wall socket where you live, you can get a very serious shock, and even if you are a person who has got relatively moist skin, you can get such a shock from it that it can kill you, or certainly can stop your heart. Lawrence Rayburn in Canada developed a much more powerful aerial system, which he calls the TREC. It pulls 10 kilowatts of power, and with that level of power flowing in the circuit, it's potentially dangerous for people who are not familiar with working with high-powered, high-voltage circuits. The aerial system has 2 4-foot diameter Archimedean spirals made from 3/4 inch diameter soft copper pipe. Each of these spirals is sandwiched between 2 sheets of Lexan plastic, and they're mounted 30 feet apart vertically. The Lexan sheet goes underneath and above each of these spirals, and the spirals being mounted above each other have got a spark gap mounted between them. They are connected by a wire shown in green here, and the spark gap, when the voltage builds up, the spark gap fires and feeds a strong pulse into this arrangement here. Now, like I said before, you need to be very careful what you're doing here. The earthing point is a plate with at least 16 square feet of surface area, and this has to be able to carry serious loads, and a signal generator is used to modulate the power and give the desired mains frequency, which in America is 60 cycles per second, and in everywhere else is 50 cycles per second. Now remember, this is a very powerful device. In other words, it could run 5 washing machines in a row from this one aerial. Lawrence has used this to power his house and to power his farm. But let me point out to you very carefully again that this arrangement here, which looks like a Joe cell, is what you see when you look down on these coils when they're pushed together. And the tuning of the system is done by these particular coils. The middle 2 coils are connected together. The outer coil is fed by the aerial, and the smallest coil feeds the next of the large coils. And there are 3-fold cascades of those. In other words, you've got 3 sets of 4 coils stepping down the high voltage from the aerial and eventually powering these 2 output coils. Now, to get the output coils giving you the power that you want to use, you use a signal generator which oscillates at mains frequency. Now, this is not an arrangement that a beginner should be fooling around with. If you want to operate or check out or test something of this nature, you must have an experienced experimenter or electrician guiding you as you go along. You are getting 600 volts from the aerial system, and you're getting it day and night being fed by this arrangement here, which is forming a tuned circuit with the ionosphere. The ionosphere has almost unlimited power. It's fed day and night by the sun. And the wire that you use in this sort of aerial is thick wire. And this thick wire is number 4 on the American wire gauge. It's a solid wire, and the smaller coils are using 8 American wire gauge diameter wire. And you'll see in the first page of the appendix of my ebook that what the wire sizes are and what their power carrying capacity is. But the power that's coming out of the final step down transformer is 10 kilowatts. So you need to be certain that this particular output transformer is powerful enough to carry 10 kilowatts. Now let me stress again, this circuit is high power and it could kill you, just as your mains wall socket could kill you. Now, one thing that needs to be stressed about aerial systems is that they are passive. They generally don't need any form of user-supplied input power, and the same applies to a range of orgone devices such as the famous Joe Cell, named after Joe Noble of Australia, who with Graham Coe and Peter Stevens popularized the device in 1992. Joe Noble did not invent the device, as he was working from an earlier patent. Orgone devices are strongly affected by people near them. A Joe Cell can run an engine of any vehicle without the need for any fuel, as it concentrates the surrounding energy field that we live in and feeds it into the engine. Bill Williams of America has run his Ford pickup truck for many miles without needing any form of conventional fuel. The Joe Cell consists of a series of concentric stainless steel cylinders filled with water which is treated very specially. Now, Joe Noble was experimenting and using stainless steel components available from a local milk factory. Today, if you want to build a Joe Cell, you need to use the dimensions shown below. The reason for this is that the Joe Cell built by Joe Noble was wrong. It was badly built. But Joe himself is a very positive influence person, and his influence on his badly built Joe Cell kept it going no matter what. If you were to build a Joe Cell and you weren't as powerful as Joe Noble was, then somebody who has negative energy capacity, who comes within 100 meters of your Joe Cell, can cause it to stop completely, and it can change the water to a form that will not work in a Joe Cell. These dimensions here, though, have been discovered since. The Joe Cell uses water, which is probably the most complex substance on the planet. And with Joe's incorrect dimensions, it takes a great deal of effort to get the water to the correct state. But with the correct dimensions, any tap water goes immediately to the correct state, which is called state 3. The container material is always stainless steel, and the engine of any vehicle to be used with it may take a week for the engine block and the metal of the engine to get aligned to the energy flow. The table here and the picture here show the dimensions which will work for a particular Joe cell design. You'll notice that there is a gap in these particular pieces, and that's because to get the cylinders of exactly the right size, it generally requires that the cylinders are wound or created or forced into shape from flat stainless steel plate. And if you do that, the gaps at the end of the forming process should be aligned, whether or not they are actually welded to keep them closed or not. But that is the arrangement, one of the arrangements for a Joe cell. Now there are two sets of dimensions here which work perfectly well with a Joe cell. There's a conical lid suggested at 57 degrees slope of sides, and an outlet pipe. Now the outlet pipe is metal, as is the sloping top of the actual Joe cell itself. The tube thicknesses are 1.637 millimeters in this instance. They use Teflon spacers to make sure that they keep their own positions, and the gaps between all of the places are 13.097 millimeters or 0.515 inches. Now this arrangement is a very powerful arrangement, and what you need to understand about this is that the pipe that is taken off, which channels the energy flow, is metal most of the way to the engine, but the last inch of pipe needs to be plastic. You don't want an actual physical electrical connection between the Joe cell and the metal of the engine. You have two options in connecting a Joe cell to an engine. You can either choose to use a connection which goes directly to the carburetor, assuming that the vehicle does have a carburetor, or you can take the tube directly to, say, a bolt head on the engine. There does not need to be any form of entrance into the engine itself, but the engine still runs. A word of warning though, if you connect an engine to a Joe cell and start the engine running, it is very, very difficult to stop the engine because it's effectively self-powered, and you don't necessarily want your engine running day and night when you're not using it. So the only way to actually shut off a Joe cell itself, if it's made with these dimensions, is to physically take it apart. So ideally you want some method of disconnecting the outlet pipe from the engine for practical purposes. Alright, supposing you don't feel up to working metal and creating cylinders in stainless steel. There is a simple device which is a case of three concentrically wound so-called torsion field coils. They're wound with 2 millimeter diameter enamel copper wire and placed around a non-ferrous pipe. That's something like a plastic pipe. Now the first layer of windings of the coil go along the length of the former being the tube that you're winding them on. You then wind a layer of tape round that and wind a second layer. Now the actual number of turns and so on is specified in my ebook, which I'll point out to you in a moment. Then you put a winding of tape again around the second layer of winding and do a final layer. Now this coil set is connected between the engine chassis and a wire which goes down into the oil. The details are in chapter 9 of the ebook, and wire lengths are given and the details of winding it. The person who fed me this information had wound his own version. He'd used the wrong wire, but even with that he was getting a 20% improvement in his car's miles per gallon performance. But properly wound, it's quite possible that this style of coil can run a car without any fuel at all being needed, and development is continuing on this sort of arrangement. Just to let you know where you can find these things, what's been presented so far in this video can be found in the document at www.freeenergy-info.com/FESIG2.pdf. FESIG stands for the Free Energy Special Interest Group, but you can get a good deal more detail on all of the devices in an ebook which is a free download from, again, www.freeenergyinfo.com/PJK lowercase book.pdf.